was some kind of sociological problem with British inspectors, that they would instinctively, when given this power, in some way wish to abuse it by bossing people around. I'm sure this doesn't happen in any other jurisdiction. So we were confronted with those three. There was some other idea that emerged. Well, there was a mystical country, usually in the A8 countries, which, because they had come to the acquis late, had taken on board regulation, but had had it in a very slim, new form. And you would look at the UK environmental legislation, regulation, for example, look like that. And in this other country, it would be like this. And this was wonderful. And that's really what we should be doing. So we thought that was it. And my staff were particularly interested. This meant that we'd get to tour the A8 countries trying to find this. But sadly, budget didn't permit that tour round the A8. So, against that background, what we did was then evidence. The whole methodology was to say, if people are criticising, complaining, see that this can be done in a better way, then okay, tell us. Give us the evidence. Show us. So, taking that approach, we launched a call for evidence. That remained open for about 3 months. And you might expect a tsunami of complaint hitting us. That really didn't happen. There were 1 or 2 people came up with complaints. As we drew nearer, it was a mythical gold-plated langoustine. And it reminded me of one of the interventions we got in the very first approach we made to a major business trade association. The director of that looked at me and said, "Yeah, gold plating, it's all a bit of a myth, isn't it?" Hold on, I've been asked to do a review into gold plating, and this senior guy is telling me it's all a myth. Well, the analysis revealed that it was not completely a myth. There were real points within this. There were areas where one did find over-implementation was taking place. Some of the over-implementation, of course, proceeded with a it wasn't the notion that people were just doing it to make life difficult for business. We didn't find any systemic over-implementation that in some way the British civil service decided that it would just make life difficult for people. On the contrary, we found that there was a high level awareness of the problems that could be created. Examples then, very quickly. Gold plating. One example in the car safety area, roadworthiness of cars. EU said, test after 4 years, test every 2 years after that. UK position, test after 3 years, test every 1 year after that. Mismatch. How did this come about? What was the justification? We didn't really get one. We went back to the Department of Transport and said, right, our recommendation to you is we'd like to see a cost-benefit analysis here. Why is it that the UK has this different structure? Why have we stepped away from what is now the EU position? Now, the interesting point there was that this was a kind of moving component of gold plating because the UK had put in place its system in the 60s and it had been a 91 directive that set out the EU position. And what we discovered was that the UK had a gap in its analysis of gold plating, that we didn't always look backwards. We were always looking forwards, what was coming out of the EU and how do we go forward with that. We didn't review backwards, saying, is what the UK has done, is that going too far? Is that unjustified? So that seemed to strike people at least as a useful assessment, and that has become a recommendation which was accepted to change the definition of gold plating in the UK. Double banking, very quickly, the fisheries. We discovered that this was legislation which some of it dated back centuries in the UK. We had 30 items of primary legislation and scores of secondary legislation in relation to fisheries. Imagine the position, there you are, you're in a fishing boat with your father, your brother and your uncle, and that's it. And you're meant to understand the law. You're meant to do what? As you're sitting out in the North Sea, pool together all 30 of these primary bits of legislation, ask your uncle to get the secondary legislation, piece it all together and work out what size of net you can use, what fish you can catch. We said that this was not really terribly helpful. Yeah, this was an area where really there had to be some kind of consolidation. It had to be made far more available to people who are using it. If people are going to ask about consultation in due course, ask me about fisheries consultation. There's an interesting point there. I won't do that right now. Regulatory creep. We found this in food hygiene. There, the regulations operated this way. There were a number of suggestions. You may do this, you may do that. This was enforced by local authorities. Local authorities were quite often saying, you shall do this. And then once they'd said, you shall do this, they said, you shall revisit this. And you've got to have your people trained formally. Then after a year, you've got to retrain them, make sure they're up to speed in training. None of this had the force of law. So we went back and said, right, if you're doing that, why? And if you don't have an explanation, be absolutely clear that that is something that is not a matter that law requires you to do. And you're dumping a whole lot of additional work on the people who are on the receiving end of this. So that broadly, those are examples of the areas we found. The point was that government has to be much more sensitive to what's going on. It has to see, in the cliche, see regulation as a process. It has to be aware all the time of the consequences it has for people. If there were two general lessons, one, consultation, been speaking about that this morning, it really has to be done very early on. If you can get engaged in the process at EU level very early on, then you've at least got a chance of working out how that regulation is going to turn out. There's not much point coming along after it's all in place and saying, oh, I don't like it. It's way too late then. That's that one problem. The other observation, I think, is the importance of having political priority given to this area. Provided there's political priority given, things will happen. In the UK, certainly political priority is there. We can see that political priority brings about the culture change that people have been talking about earlier. Without that political push, the culture change is very slow to happen. Culture change is always difficult. If you have that push, it makes it happen. I'll shut up now.